moderator is Aruna Rao. She is an independent scholar and practitioner specializing in gender and institutional change. Former president of the board of the Association of Women in Development, she has over 20 years experience in addressing gender issues in a variety of development organizations, primarily in Asia. She headed the gender team at BRAC, a large rural development NGO in Bangladesh, which pioneered a new approach to gender and organizational change. Earlier based in Bangkok, she coordinated a program on research and training on women's roles and gender differences in development projects. She has consulted with numerous international organizations and written extensively on gender-related topics.
Good morning, everyone. I'm very happy to have this opportunity to share some thoughts. Really, it's work in progress, if you will. Some of the conceptual underpinnings of what we think of as women's leadership. And I've titled my remarks, Leadership for Social Transformation, Challenging Institutions and Challenging Ourselves. I recently looked into a new course offered, which is called Strategic Leadership for Women. And it's for women in leaders of non-profit as well as corporate organizations. And it focused primarily on building women's presentation of themselves, their negotiating skills, on enhancing their ability to read their environment and mapping a road to success within that environment. And I think this kind of approach to women's leadership is very common in this kind of genre. And I think, though, that it is strikingly different from what I would call leadership for social transformation. So let me take a few moments to explain that. Leadership for social transformation is really not about playing by the rules. It's about changing the rules. That's the challenge of the feminist movement. That's the challenge of the work we do. So I'd like to talk for a few minutes about two aspects of this challenge. One is institutional transformation, and the other is individual transformation. What do they mean? What might be the connections between the two? And what might be the implications of the two for our ways of thinking and our ways of acting? Now, when I talk of institutions, I'm using the term the way in which Douglas North defines it. That is, institutions are not organizations, but institutions are the structures that humans impose on human interaction. It's a much broader concept of what institutions are. So it refers to formal rules of the game, it refers to the informal rules of conduct, and it refers to the mechanisms that enforce both. Our ability to make change then obviously depends on our ability to change formal rules, but it also depends on our ability to change the informal ones. The informal ones are much more complex. They are sometimes hidden, they're very powerful, and they really refer to the institutional norms, the values, the structures and processes that underlie and shape our interaction. Now, when we work at the level of policy change, we are really working at the level of changing the formal rules of the game. And that is necessary, very important. But it's not sufficient to make the kind of change that we want to see happen. Now, when we're dealing with this messy, intractable, difficult terrain of the informal rules, our work is really cut out for us. It's very difficult terrain. We don't know very much about it. And we also don't know very much about how to change it. Now, these informal rules, if you think about it, they're embedded in almost everything. They're embedded in language, they're embedded in symbols, they're embedded in social customs, they're embedded in institutions like marriage, markets, local governance structures like village panchayats, and they're also embedded in what we might call modern organizations, the kinds of organizations that you and I live and work in. Now, these organizations, there's a double whammy here. These organizations are also built on principles of 19th century Newtonian science, in that they have inbuilt assumptions about human nature and how work gets done that are often mechanistic and controlling. And they promote a worldview that sees power as a limited commodity, not, as the way Nolene described it, as power that is really empowering. Now, in the organizations that you and I are familiar with, these institutional principles, here's the double whammy, are overlaid with cultural values and patriarchal norms that are often against women, that are women unfriendly, and or are exclusionary in many ways. Now, there's been some very good recent research that's delved into what we might call the gender-biased nature of institutions. They look at a variety of organizations, whether it's public bureaucracies, whether it's international organizations, NGOs, and corporate organizations. So, for example, through the work of people like Ingrid Cardam, Kathy Stout, Anne-Marie Gertz, and Joan Acker, we have learned that these gender biases in organizations are built into the very foundations of organizations. Joan Acker calls this the gendered substructure of organizations, and she characterizes it as being built on a fundamental separation of life and a consequent devaluation of life from the rest, or what we might call paid work. Now, through the work of organizational theorists like Edgar Schein, we have also learned that organizational culture shapes organizational outcomes, and that culture is often hidden, it's not obvious, and that it needs to be uncovered by a variety of methods. Now, if we extrapolate that to our world, we can hypothesize that if you have a gender-biased organization, it's likely that you will have gender-biased outcomes. So even if we have all our policies and our agendas in place, should we expect that the organizations that we mandate to carry them out will in fact do so? Well, not very likely. Why? Because we know that organizations are not rational bodies. They are living, breathing microcosms of the societies that they live in. This has to do what some of us call the deep structure of organizations, and it refers back to what Douglas North was talking about. And deep structure of organizations really is a way of saying there is an interlocking system of beliefs and values within organizations that is hidden, taken for granted, often unquestioned, that perpetuates gender inequality, including the assumption that there really are no other alternatives to business as usual. Now, there are some of us who've worked on this area. Again, I must say it's work in progress, but there are some ideas that seem to be emerging which describe what we call this deep structure. What are they? One is the belief about power and hierarchy and their expression, and Nolene has spoken about this. The other is the split between work and family, which I alluded to earlier. The other is a narrow focus on instrumentality, very narrow goals as opposed to larger objectives for social change. And also the tendency to valorize individual effort over the work of the collective, and one that does not recognize in many cases what we are coming to call invisible work. Now, there are many other aspects of deep structures of organizations that we could think of that have to do with their particular histories, their particular locational specificities, their political context, all of which we need to uncover to see how are these hindering the kind of social change agenda that we have in mind. Now, when we talk with this kind of understanding, when we talk about leadership for social transformation, to me what it means is providing the vision and the paths to changing these institutional principles and their manifestation in organizations as a means to changing our lives and the world we live in. We don't have a blueprint for what a transformed organization looks like, but we have some good ideas to guide us. All of you, I'm sure, are familiar with the work of Peter Senge on learning organizations that has a lot of very good ideas to build on. There's also a growing global set of, I can't call it a movement as such, but it is a network of activists, practitioners, scholars, and I see some here in the audience, who are working with these kinds of principles in a variety of organizations to try to change them. Now, at the heart of this transformation, again, as Nalin, it's very nice that our ideas are really coinciding here, is this whole business of the exercise of power. Much of how we experience power is in the context of hierarchy. Now, it's often practiced, as we know, as a win-win situation, and it's viewed as a limited commodity. If I have more, you have less. This practice of power, we know from experience, devalues participation. It silences voices that could otherwise bring to the table different experiences and different knowledge that could really bear on the kinds of problems and issues we're concerned with. We know this, we say this, we don't often practice this. Too often what we try to do is get more power so that we can push what we believe is a better agenda over that of others. Now, I'd like to spend a few minutes talking about individual transformation. Because I think that in order to do the kind of institutional transformation work I was talking about, that it really is fueled by a change in ourselves, a sense of ourselves that really can help this move forward. Now, part of the wonder that a different kind of exercise of power holds, for example, power viewed as win-win and infinite, like energy, is a potential to transform relationships, and with that, the potential to transform institutions. Now, this is fundamentally implicated, I think, in the way in which we look at ourselves and the way in which we view others. A clue to thinking about this that I've come across recently and I'm quite intrigued with is the work by quantum physicist David Bohm. What he tried to do was to resolve the contradictions between, and I know this is really a world apart, but between relativity theory and quantum theory. But he drew from that and he tried to extrapolate those ideas to the fragmentation in our lives, in society as a whole. Now, what Bohm suggests is that the material world and consciousness are parts of a single unbroken totality of movement. So that means everything in the universe affects everything else because we are all part of the same whole. And in each one of us is enfolded the whole of mankind. So when we're engaged in something that is deeply meaningful and are tuned to one another, then human beings can participate in the unfolding of what he calls the implicate or pre-manifest order into the manifest or explicate order. Now, the challenge for us is to discover what is required to build these relationships and live in them. What guiding principles can we draw for leadership from this work? There's another interesting author, Joseph Jaworski, who's written a book called Synchronicity, The Inner Path to Leadership, which provides a few guidelines. We need to be open to fundamental shifts of mind from seeing the world as primarily made up of things as a world that's primarily made up of relationships. The future is not fixed. We live in a world of possibilities. And when this fundamental shift of mind occurs, then our sense of identity shifts as well, and we begin to accept each other as legitimate human beings. So in this worldview, leadership is about how we collectively shape our destiny. Now, we all know very well that the forces for change, the forces for the status quo, keeping things the way they are extremely powerful. The daily pressures to play the game by the rules are overwhelming almost. But if we believe that the way we think and the way we act shapes reality, then we need to work on these three levels: the level of ourselves, the level of our institutions, and relationships. As individuals, we must be a force for transformation, regardless of how powerful those forces seem to be aligned against us. And I think there would be very good examples of that in this room. And as a collective, we must participate in creating new realities. I think the real challenge for us, one that interests me a lot, and that I hope that we can have a conversation about over the course of today, is how we can take these ideas of individual transformation and institutional transformation, this understanding, put it into the kind of world we live in, which is a world that's defined in very particular economic, political, historical ways, and work in that context to try to map a way forward that is informed by these ideas, that is fueled by this process of of individual transformation, to try to address the concrete problems that we have been talking about, that Nana's raised, that Nolene talked about as well. And I hope that we will have a chance to explore these over the course of today.